Yeah. Okay.
Hello, everybody. This is Russell for Let's Get Racing. I'm really, really excited and honoured to be joined by Lydia Hislop today. So, Lydia, thank you so much for finding the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much for having me. Thanks for inviting me.
No problem. Well, what we try and do with these interviews is have some of our owners who are new to the sport understand some of the different roles that are present within the sport, both obviously directly involved in the competition, but those also related to it. And of course, as Broadcaster of the Year, one of the most respected journalists in the sport, we're really privileged to have you along. So thank you.
Thank you.
So Lydia, do you want to say just a little bit about how you got into journalism and broadcasting and the relationship between that and horse racing for you?
Well, first of all, how I got into horse racing is probably the best place to start, which was my granddad. He was a terrible punter. Or he could have been a good punter if he'd stuck to his first view, but somehow between leaving the house and writing the betting slip, he always changed his mind, and the rest of the family never understood why. And so we'd often follow him in, and we'll all be cheering a winner, and we'd turn around and he'd have a really sort of glum look on his face, and we'd know that the yips had happened somewhere between leaving the house and getting to the betting shop. So he got me into racing because I adored my granddad. We spent a lot of time together. I come from Wolverhampton. We used to go to Wolverhampton racing when it was a turf track. I saw Indian Skimmer make her 3-year-old seasonal debut at Wolverhampton. Imagine that now. I suppose you get a Enable at Newcastle. But yeah, so we went along to that, and then as I got a bit older, he took me to the Wednesday of Cheltenham when there were just 3 days, the good old days, to see the Queen Mother Champion Chase Day, and so we went there together from when I was 8 until I was 18, and then I went away to university and I did English, and I was not really sure what I wanted to do, and everyone around me was becoming management consultants and other things that I would rather, I don't know, stab myself to death with a fork rather than do. I might be a bit extreme, but it's hyperbole. I wrote to the Sporting Life and Racing Post, and I asked whether I could have any work experience, and the editor of the Sporting Life, who was Tom Clark, actually wrote back by return post and invited me down to an interview. So I went to do an interview, and as a result of that, he said, come along and do some work experience for a month, and if we like you, you can stay for 3. So I ended up staying for 4, and then there was a job that came up in one of their news agencies. It was called Race News, and at that point that was one of the ways into being a racing journalist. You had to accept very low wages, which in London was, quite an issue. At the time I lived in Bedford, it literally cost more to get to work than I was earning for the year.
Oh my goodness.
So I had to negotiate coming in at a later time so that I at least had some money left at the end of it. So but anyway, it was a good thing because I was there for 10 months and 4 days, and I learned quite a lot about news. I established quite a few contacts with the industry, particularly on the industry side of things, as in the sort of public facing side of things. So people within what was then the British Horse Racing Board, people within the Racecourse Association, bookmakers, bookmaker representative groups, all of those sort of background infrastructure, as well as talking to trainers, owners, and jockeys. So it was a really good grounding. And while I was there, Chris Poole, who I don't know whether any of your members will know, he was quite a famous racing journalist, looked like Father Christmas, really big character. He was coming up for retirement. He was the racing correspondent of the Evening Standard. And I wrote to the editor, Max Hastings, and said, would there be an opportunity to just have some work? I wasn't applying to be racing correspondent. I wasn't off my rocker. And he, again, invited me into interview, and then dispatched me to his sports editor, who is Michael Hurd. And we went and had a drink, and he offered me a 6-month contract to produce 2 features a week on horse racing, which was amazing. And it actually enabled me to do all sorts of things. Like it made me to buy a car, which I hadn't been able to afford to do before. All sorts of things. It was just sort of opened up a sort of different kind of opportunities. But halfway through, there was a new sports editor, and he brought me down, and I thought it was a get to know you session. It turns out he wanted to sack me because I'd never written any news for them. And I pointed out to him, because at this point I'd been working for the Racing Post writing news for 3 months, that my contract didn't ask me to write news. I never realised that they wanted news from me. All they had to do was ask. I'd write the news that I was writing with the Post for the Standard. So he said, "Oh, okay. I thought you were some pony clubbing friend of Max's. We'll keep you on for the other the other 3 months to see how you go." So at the end of those 3 months, I was made racing correspondent, and I did that for 5 years.
Okay. And I mean, interesting that you started out as a written journalist, and of course now you broadcast as well. What's the relationship between the two for you? I mean, do you prefer one or the other, or do you find they're kind of symbiotic?
Are they symbiotic? Yeah, can be. I prefer writing. I prefer that, but it's not possible anymore. So that's the reason why I ended up in broadcasting. So when I was racing correspondent for the Standard, it started to become pretty obvious that print journalism was shrinking. Newspapers hadn't figured out how to deal with the internet at that point. And you could see it sort of in straight up pagination, in terms of, like, for when I worked for the Times, which was a bit afterwards, I'll explain that in a moment, but we started off on a Saturday with 48 pages of sport. I mean, that would be unthinkable now. And by the time I left the Times, they were down to 12 pages of sport. So, you know, that directly correlates to the number of journalists that they're prepared to employ. So I could see that that was shrinking, and TV wasn't. So I thought, okay, I will try and sort of broaden my skill base and see if I can get into doing some broadcasting as well. So I started off with the racing channel, which predates the original At the Races. And I did a couple of shifts on there, which I found terrifying. And then the original At the Races relaunched with this sort of whiz bang publicity, and they were looking for new presenters. And at that point I applied, and I think probably because of my journalistic background, I got it. I don't think it was to do with my TV skills. And so I ended up then doing 4 days a week for them, and they let me carry on doing 1 day a week as a columnist for the Standard, because the Standard wanted to keep me, and I didn't want to completely relinquish writing. So I did that for as long as they existed, and they were great days because they had a huge budget. They had a whole schedule to fill that they wanted to fill with new content from 7 in the morning until whatever time the racing finished in the evening. Unfortunately, the model was unsustainable, and that's when there was another split. So there was GG Racing, and who had 10 tracks at that point, and the original At the Races, and then we have what we have now, which is At the Races that became Sky Sports Racing, and Racing TV, Racing UK that became Racing TV. So yeah, and then while I was working for when I started working for Racing UK, that's right, I started to work for the Times as well. So I was transferred from being a columnist for the Standard to being a columnist for the Times.
Okay. I mean,
I also worked for the BBC for a while as well, which was not good.
Why was it not good? Can you say, or is it too indelicate?
It's quite indelicate, I suppose. Lots of reasons. Probably I wasn't ready. I didn't want to be just a straight up presenter. They're kind of into straight up presenters. One of the people who's still in charge says that, you should be able to drop a presenter from the moon anywhere, and they should be able to present about whatever. And that's right. That is a skill if you'll be able to do that. But I'm quite interested in going deeper. I am interested in horse racing, and I'm the kind of person who wants to know their subject rather than anything else. And so I suppose they and I weren't for each other. It was probably a bit too early for me, and it's quite a what's the word I'm looking for? Difficult place to work. The people I work with were mostly lovely.
Yeah.
But it's very political.
Okay.
I think is what I'd say, and that's not. I don't do that very well.
Well, that's an interesting segue on to something I wanted to ask you about, actually, this idea of being political, I suppose. And one of the things that I really, I think is really admirable as a quality in you, when I see you interviewing people, is that you don't shy away from some of the difficult questions. In fact, often, you go straight to there. And I remember particularly when Nikki Henderson was being very choiceful around where to run Altior, and you sort of pulled that out. And I wondered whether, in a relatively small industry, whether as a broadcaster and someone like yourself who likes to ask a difficult question, how you strike that balance and what you have to be careful of or mindful of yourself.
It's not just broadcasting. I think it would be print journalism as well. I think the thing I've probably got on my side, if we're going to be very honest here, is longevity. I got a lot of people's backs up at the start because I was just trying to do the job properly and how I thought it should be done. And to me, that involves having some sort of objective distance. Now, obviously, the complication is the longer you're in the sport, the more people get to know you. And so that objective distance is difficult. But nonetheless, I would still hope that the people that I have on certain things work with would understand. And I feel that they would cop with it now that people kind of know what I am a bit better, would understand that I have a job to do. And my responsibility as a journalist or a broadcaster is to ask the questions that the viewer or the reader wants to be asked, and obviously only reasonable questions. I mean, not the things that people might type out on Twitter and rant about. I mean, reasonable questions that people would objectively wish to be asked, and that's my job. I mean, we're called the media for a reason, because we're in between the subject and the people who want to understand that subject. So it's not particularly pleasant. I mean, it's confrontation or to any degree isn't particularly pleasant, but I'm just trying to do the job. I'm just trying to ask a reasonable question and get to the nub of what's happening and make sure it's explained and give the person an opportunity to put their point of view. I mean, people often feel in those kind of situations that it's a one-way traffic, but it's providing somebody with a platform to explain something. And if your explanation doesn't survive the oxygen of reasonable people watching, well, then there's something wrong with the explanation, isn't there? Equally, if it does and people go, actually, that's a really good point, well, then everybody's benefited from taking a step forward.
And maybe the Nikki Henderson example kind of stuck in my mind, but I think it's difficult for many of your colleagues as well to find that balance. And like you said, maybe longevity helps, but also maybe how you show up and how you are with people, Lydia, as well. So it's really a pleasure to watch.
I don't know, maybe. I mean, who knows? As I said, it was really tricky in the early days. There were a number of times when people made things very, very difficult indeed, and often misrepresented things that went on. I mean, the thing that many broadcasters would say to you, and probably many writers, although it's easier to point to the subject material there, is that they'll get a complaint, or more often their boss will get a complaint. And then it will turn out that the person who's made the complaint hasn't actually watched what was said and has no idea actually what was said. And if I had £1 for the amount of times that has happened to me, I would be very rich indeed. Wow. And once you go into that process, the complaint often doesn't really survive the rigor of actually having to listen to what was said.
Sure. And maybe to divert you away from your career into another passion that I know you have, which is the British Racing School. And I know many of our owners won't necessarily have heard of the British Racing School. So perhaps you could say a little bit about the school, why it means something to you and your role as a trustee there.
Yeah, I've been a trustee for more than 20 years. Somebody asked me they were looking, I think, to diversify their board and their trustees board. And at the time I was in my 20s and female, tick, tick. And I have been there. I have been there ever since. It is a great place. We get many people who have never even sat on a horse. And at the end of a course, these days usually a 14-week course, they are able to look after a racehorse and ride it out for trainers and have a full-time job. We guarantee them a job in racing. And quite often these are young people who haven't found that school is for them, might come from various different backgrounds and actually come here and thrive hugely. They're given responsibility, they're given an element of independence, and mostly they seize that with both hands. you know, clearly once they then go to the yards, that's not, I mean, 14 weeks, we're not suggesting that we've made, you know, ready-made, you know, champion jockeys. And the point is, we're not actually making jockeys at that point either. We're making people who work in racing, the people who will look after your horse at the yard, you know, make sure that it's properly cared for, looked after, fed and watered, and they're keeping an eye on that horse and that it is comfortable and well. They might ride the horse out, all of those things. We're talking about the fundamental people that make this industry work. And then you might progress to want to be a jockey. I mean, obviously many young people do want to do that because it's the sort of, you know, exciting, you know, public facing bit, isn't it? But others see a different path, you know, will become senior stable staff, could travel around the world as traveling head grooms, could move into training. You can even move into other, you know, there's all sorts of jobs within horse racing. Having that kind of way in is just a really useful thing to do. And the school is great. I mean, the atmosphere there is really strong, and I love being a trustee. And I'm a very strong advocate of what it does. And there's obviously the National Horse Racing College in Doncaster as well, which we shouldn't forget, but I'm not trustee of. I media train jockeys there, as I media train jockeys for the British Racing School as part of my professional job, not to do with my trustee work, obviously.
Sure. Well, Lydia, we've taken 15 or so minutes of your time and we really appreciate it. I'm sure you've got a busy weekend ahead with the racing, but also with the work related to the racing. So thank you for joining us. Thanks for your time.
Thanks for asking me.
And best of luck for the rest of 2022. I hope it goes well for you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to you and all of your members as well.
Thanks very much, Lydia.